Welcome back to PLS 510. If you're keeping track, this is going to be the seventh lecture in the forages class, and today it's a really exciting topic, and a topic that's even today being researched, and we're learning new things. And I hope to both give you enough background that you understand how to apply the knowledge about tall fescue and its endophyte, but also to maybe give you an appreciation for just how biologically fascinating this interaction is. So let's get started. As we said earlier in the class, and probably more times than just once, most feels are fescue based, and most are infected with the wild type or toxic endophyte. First of all, let's start with some definitions to possibly start making some sense out of this. And let me back up and say the toxic endophyte is actually a fungus that grows within the plant. It grows down at the very base of the plant, and then also it accumulates in the seed. But you'll hear more about that a little later today. Some definitions. First of all, the presence of this endophyte within tall fescue causes animal problems, and this is a long-standing fact, but yet on the other hand, in my lifetime we have discovered exactly why. When tall fescue was released in 1943 as Kentucky 31, the agronomic characteristics of the grass were without question, but it was highly controversial in its animal effects. We had a farm in northern Kentucky, the Eden Shale Farm, that was planted with Kentucky 31 tall fescue that just caused an innumerable number of livestock problems, cattle problems, and they didn't understand why, and they do now. But the presence of this endophyte in tall fescue, here are the symptoms that you'll see in dairy and beef cattle, sheep, and deer. Not every single one in every species, but basically these are the ruminant symptoms. Reduced feed intake is going to be the primary cause of a lot of the negative animal performance, but certainly when they're grazing tall fescue, they don't eat as much. When they don't eat as much, they don't gain as much. There's not as much milk production. There is an increased respiration rate, elevated body temperature, and rough hair coat. And those three symptoms are part of the impact that fescue and the endophyte in particular has on the grazing ruminant. It makes them run a temperature, in effect, without an infection. Because they are hot, and they are hot, and they're at discomfort or not comfortable. They spend more time in the water and the shade. They graze less, so that's less intake. There is low blood serum prolactin, and that is one of the most sensitive measures of exposure to the toxic principle of tall fescue. Blood serum prolactin. Excessive salivation and lower reproductive performance. All of these arise and have been proven to be from the endophyte of tall fescue and not tall fescue itself. Fescue toxicosis is a broad term we're going to use to describe the collective negative effects of the toxic endophyte of tall fescue across all of the species that may consume it, particularly ruminant species, but also horses and others. Fescue foot is a particularly graphic and sad problem of livestock, of cattle grazing tall fescue, and it's a dry, gangrenous condition of the body extremities of cattle consuming TE, or toxic endophyte tall fescue. It usually causes lameness and or the loss of tips of tails or ears, but may result in sloughing of hooves or feet, and in these cases the animals must be euthanized. Fescue foot is generally associated with cold weather. The why part of this slide, we really haven't put all the pieces together for you, but if I'm going to do it now. The presence of the toxic principle of tall fescue that's produced because of the interaction between the fungus and tall fescue causes the veins and near the extremities of cattle, of ruminants, and actually of horses too, to constrict. Since cattle cool themselves in the summer by flushing blood to the surface of the skin, if they can't do that, they're going to be heat stressed. And in the wintertime, the opposite would occur, in that you don't have blood in the extremities, and in the wintertime, since that is it tends to happen anyway with the cold, then you get a double problem, and it results in some years in loss of those hooves. They will just simply walk right out of the hoof. So why is fescue foot generally associated with cold weather? You've got the vasoconstriction effect of blood supply limitations to the extremities, on top of that naturally occurring with cold weather. Already used this once, TE, toxic endophyte tall fescue, and that refers to tall fescue that contains the wild type of endophyte that infects most acres of tall fescue. Endophyte free, we abbreviated EF or E minus. This term refers to tall fescue that does not contain an endophyte. In the 70s, when we discovered on a farm in Georgia, that we had cattle on one side of the farm that had been kept separate, and on that side of the farm that had symptoms of tall fescue toxicosis, and had cattle, the same base genetics, on the right-hand side of the farm that didn't mix with the left hand, and they were all slick and performing much, much better. When the team from the USDA unit there in Georgia went out and tried to find out why that is, they knew that there could be an endophytic fungus within tall fescue, and that in fact was the difference. What we didn't know about that endophytic fungus relationship was what it did in the plant. That this was a clear indication, or a clear example of what it is that causes tall fescue toxicosis. And this set off a flurry of research and seed development and variety development with people. We found that we could, of course, take seed from the good side, the endophyte-free side, and make new varieties out of that, and that's going to be endophyte-free. We also found out that we could age seed or heat seed or treat seed with fungicide and convert it to endophyte-free status. So in the how blank at the bottom, you can age seed, you can treat seed with a kind of a specialized regime of heat and moisture, and also you can treat it with certain fungicides. And you'll kill the fungus growing within the plant, and realize that this is two plants growing together, the fescue endophytic fungus and tall fescue. Then NE, novel endophyte tall fescue, or NETF. We identified naturally occurring non-toxic endophytes in the late 1990s, and I say we, that was in New Zealand, that these do not produce ergot alkaloids. And ergot alkaloids is a class of alkaloids. The toxin of tall fescue is an ergot alkaloid. It does produce the other compounds that make tall fescue persist against drought and heat and insect herbivory. Novel endophyte strains have been inserted into some fescue varieties and are now commercially available. There are quite a few, in fact. And either endophyte-free fescues or novel endophyte fescues can be referred to as being non-toxic fescue. This is a graphical representation of the three types of tall fescue based on their endophyte status. The left-hand drawing would be the Kentucky 31 type with the toxic endophyte. This would be what was found on that hillside in Menifee County in 1931. Treat that seed with heat or fungicide, or age it, and you can make it endophyte free. Same fescue genetics, but without the endophyte. And you can take that genetics and you can insert in in the laboratory, growing on Petri plates, a novel endophyte tall fescue, and you get a totally different product in the novel product, novel plus tall fescue, novel endophyte plus tall fescue, than you do with the toxic endophyte plus tall fescue or the endophyte free. Now, the performance has been proven many times of livestock when grazing either the endophyte free or the novel products is the same. It's the same. But what we discovered in the mid 80s when endophyte free varieties were coming out in some abundance was that when you took the endophyte out of tall fescue, that it became a different enough plant that it was not as tolerant of heat and drought and other sorts of stresses. And so a lot of those first generation of endophyte free varieties did not persist very long. And farmers, rightfully so, have a skeptical attitude then about the novel endophyte tall fescues. And ever since that time, the 90s or so, we have been going about putting out demonstrations, putting them on farms, trying to see, are they tough? Are they tougher than endophyte frees were? How long will they persist under regular, normal management? And truthfully, we're still doing that to this day. We continue to put them out because the only way to prove a variety lasts for 25 years is to put it out and check on it 25 years later. And farmers do expect tall fescue to live forever. We also use the term summer slump a lot, and it's the drop-off in weight gain of animals grazing fescue during warm weather due to high temperatures, high levels of urquid alkaloids, to some degree increased fiber in the diets, but the increase in fiber in the diets will not explain the drop-off in weight gain. What will explain that drop-off in weight gain is less grazing time and lower forage intake. I wanted to spend one separate slide or use one separate slide here to talk about fescue toxicosis and the health effect in cattle. So if you talk about the physiological effect in cattle, we've already mentioned this, but it's vasoconstriction, narrowing of the blood vessels. And that means that the cow or the ruminant cannot regulate its temperature, or it has poor thermoregulation, problems in heat and problems in the cold. Heat stress, elevated body temperatures, obviously in the warm times of the year, and fescue foot in the cold. I do want to repeat this point because this point and the fact that lower intake explains the lower performance in cattle due to the toxic endophyte. Since lower intake is the major driver for negative animal performance outside of the prolactin system and some other things, then anything we can do to get more nutrition in cattle or other ruminants is going to offset the negative effects of the toxic endophyte. This is a set of calves in southwest Missouri that are obviously have long hair. This is summertime. They did not shed their winter hair coat off. They're also under heat stress. The mud on the side of this set of this steer is from the fact that they were in the shade, they urinated, they created a puddle, and then they just rolled over it in it trying to get cooler. And these are the typical symptoms of a set of what we would call fescue calves that are on highly infected, endophyte infected and toxic tall fescue. I want to use several graphs here and do them quickly just to show you some differences in magnitude of performance, because I think it's important to know in your mind, are we talking a small difference in performance or large? This is a list of studies where steers were given toxic E+ tall fescue of some kind to eat versus non-toxic E-. The difference averaged across all these studies is 0.86 pounds per head per day, highly significant. I want to mention horses at this point too. One of the most insidious and disturbing effects of the fescue endophyte on horses happens with pregnant mares in the third trimester. If they are consuming significant amounts of toxic tall fescue, then the symptoms that you can observe are going to be abortions, prolonged pregnancy, foaling problems, large foals, foal death or mare death, which is disturbing, thick or retained placentas, and we call that red bag syndrome, or agalactia. This is some work that was done in Alabama looking at the effects of fungal endophyte on pregnant mares and foals grazing tall fescue, and you can see that there were some significant negative effects, a lot of foaling problems, no milk in the mares, foals that were born dead, low foal survival, and even some mare death. So now we know that fescue, the endophyte, is the cause. We know it causes lots of animal issues, so let's talk about the cause. This is the cause, the endophyte of tall fescue. And we would say, to clarify, the toxic endophyte of tall fescue. What you are looking at is an electron micrograph of the epidermis of a tall fescue plant taken from the leaves at the base of the plant. The endophyte of tall fescue is a fungus. When you plate out, if you took a bit of that base of the plant and put it on auger, like you were trying to grow out a culture of something, over time, that this fungus then will grow outside of the plant, and then you can see it, the mycelium, just like you're seeing stained here. The lighter colored, it looks like, I guess, almost a snake or something. The lighter colored material are the fungal hyphae, or the mycelium, in between the cells of tall fescue. So it's a fungus. It grows between cells. The mycelium, or hyphae, were present in the stem basin and the seed stalk and seed head, but not present in the leaf blade. However, the toxins of tall fescue are in the leaf blade, but as we will see a little bit later, they are in lower concentrations in the leaf blade. So the tall fescue, with its endophyte and its toxins, causes this problem. The toxins as a group are called ergot alkaloids. There are other ways to get exposed to ergot alkaloids in livestock outside of tall fescue. So the alkaloids in tall fescue that cause the problem with livestock are in that class of ergot alkaloids. The endophyte of tall fescue has many names. When I started in about 1986, we called it Epicloe typhina. Later, Acremonium caenophyllum. After that, Neotyphodium caenophyllum. And now, Epicloe caenophyllum. In fact, we were using Neotyphodium last year, 2019. In 2020, Epicloe caenophyllum. Obviously, if you're reading about this, you may find this any one of these names used. And this is the species, even though it may be a toxic endophyte or the wild type endophyte or the non-toxic endophyte. The toxic endophyte, the wild type endophyte, is another name, common names for that, the endophyte that causes us problems. And I mentioned the Eden Shale Farm a while ago, just briefly a few minutes ago. The scene in the background here is actually a hilltop pasture on the Eden Shale Farm in Owen County, Kentucky. So the endophyte in tall fescue is an internal fungus. You never see it ever, unless you're growing it out in a petri plate in laboratory conditions. So in the real world, out at the farm level, you're not ever going to see that fungus outside the plant. It's present in most of our tall fescue fields in Kentucky. It's spread only by seed, and that third point right there is very important. It's the most important piece of information on that slide, and obviously the fact that it has negative animal effects, you already know. But if you want to think of the fact that it never grows outside the plant, the only way for it to spread from the field it is in is to take seed from an infected plant and take it to another field. This is a graphical representation of a tall fescue plant on the left. On the upper right is going to be a stained cross section of a piece of fescue seed. The lower left is a stained bit of epidermal cells taken from the base of tall fescue down here. The squiggly darker blue lines running through this bottom picture, those are the hyphae of the endophyte of tall fescue. The upper picture happens after the seed head begins to elongate, and this is like, think of it as an elevator to the penthouse. When this seed head elongates, because this plant has been vernalized, in other words, had the winter cold treatment that makes those cells at the base of the plant begin to differentiate and then to elongate and push up the seed stalk, those cells then carry bits of the mycelium up to the top of the plant, and that's what this is. The darker lines running through and among the cells there in the cross section of the seed are the fungal hyphae, and they are concentrated at a much greater concentration, at least in terms, they're easier to see up there than down here. Do want to mention the fact that calving percentages vary quite a bit with E- and E+ tall fescue. When we don't have the endophyte, we have 90 plus calving percentages. With the endophyte, we have, this is, well, between 50 and 60. We also have, the endophyte has negative effect across the board here. Cow gains, pregnancy rates, and weaning weights. So in terms of the sellable product off of an acre of tall fescue that's infected, you see a change in weaning weights. And the difference among summed across these studies is 72 pounds per calf as a 205-day adjusted weaning weight. So there's the fungus. All right, so let's talk about tall fescue toxicity and a few things that are going to be important to management going forward. Toxicity varies in the plant, and let's spend a minute or two on that first point. If you look on the right, you've got a stylized tall fescue plant. Ergovaline is the toxic alkaloid. Then you've got an indication that the bottom portion of the plant has about 1,700 parts per billion ergovaline. The middle portion, the leaves, about 569, and the upper portion, the seed, about 1142. We know that the threshold for species varies. That's the third point on the slide on the left. But for cattle, it's about it could be as low as 300, but certainly when it gets to 600, then we're going to have opportunity to have negative animal effects. So look at if you want to look at that graph on the right and think about the management implications, there's at least a couple that jump out at you. First of all, they should never graze the seed heads, and we should keep them mowed off. If we can keep it as leafy as possible, then the portion of the plant that we need to eat, which is the highest quality, the leaves, it happens to also be the lowest in concentration of ergovaline. And at the base of the plant, where we don't want them to eat at all, is about 1,700. So therefore, we just cannot eat that bottom of the plant without having negative effects. A student today in class observed that oh my gosh, then you've got to be just about perfect in order to graze tall fescue. Well, you know what? That's exactly the conclusion that most farmers have when they see this, and it is a great observation. And the next part of this lecture, after we finish today, or this section, is going to try to answer that question just a little bit. Now, the last point on this slide is going to be this middle point. Toxicity levels drop in half in cured hay. This is one of the few times that I can think of that hay is better after it's cut than before. And in this case, ergovaline is not very stable outside of the fresh plant. So once you cut a fescue plant and it begins to cure and dry, the natural respiration and chemistry that's ongoing in those leaves will metabolize ergovaline to non-toxic compounds. Interesting forage trivia for today. When is hay better after it's cut than before? So the thresholds do vary. I told you 500 to 600 parts per billion with cattle, 250 to 300 parts per billion for pregnant mares in the third trimester. You know, and the whole trick to this, if it was just everything was 100% tall fescue and these were the toxicity levels, then you would be a genius consultant, because you would know without a doubt whether a field was toxic or not, and you would know then what you needed to do. But it's hard to assess exactly what livestock are eating in a grazed pasture. So that leads to the point. How can we even raise livestock if the endophyte is so toxic and fescue is everywhere? And with that thought and that question, I want to close out this part of Lecture 7 and take a little break. So let's take an intermission. Thank you for your attention, and we will see you in the next lecture. Thank you.